Yeah, thanks. So hi everyone, and thank you for joining in for our talk, which concerns immunology, which hasn't received so much attention from the philosophical community, at least so far, and with respect to COVID-19. We want to, in particular here, we want to present and defend several claims. So the immune system is much more than just a defense system. Then the notions like strong and weak immunity give rise to misconceptions. And this idea, basically COVID-19 illustrates some of that. And then we want to focus on three crucial features of the immune systems, which should help improve our understanding. So the COVID-19 pandemic caused by the SARS-CoV-2 basically invites the talk of host defense from a pathogen, and also the idea that the stronger the defense, the better for the host. And this general idea is also somehow basically illustrated by the talk of boosting immunity using vaccines, or by CDC communication, which notes that immunocompromised people may be in danger because of having weaker immune system. And also here is a funny illustration from the journal Science, basically illustrating some war metaphors. And if you can notice, here's even a cat being thrown at the coronavirus. Now, the view that the immune system primarily is a defense system is also very much present in all major immunology textbooks, by which future generations of scientists and medical doctors are educated. But the view that the immune system is primarily a defense system, and the stronger it is, the better for the host, is actually problematic in the context of both the COVID-19 as well as going beyond. And why is that? Well, because, as we will claim, it contributes to the distortion of the overall picture of what the immune system is, what it does, and why it sometimes fails. So over to Gregor.
Thank you very much. Right, and this idea of defense is its historical origins and philosophical reflections on the foundations of immunology. That's a project that has been pursued by a small community of philosophers, and with impressive results, forming a community at least in the last decade. But it's also interesting to see just where the main question about immunity being about what is being recognized and what the immune response being triggered by that amounts to, and what the immune system basically is and does, has been based by on a very influential idea since the 1960s by McFarland Burnett. This idea that there is a self and non-self, whereas the immune system would tolerate basically anything that belongs to the self and attack anything that belongs to the non-self, which intuitively was a very appealing idea and was very influential in hosting the theoretical framework of immunology. But there are some non-trivial problems with that, because a lot of what is considered self can be attacked by the immune system as well. So think of cancers. There's a lot of non-self, including the microbes, are actively tolerated and are part of our healthy organism and is not attacked, even though it's not non-self. So this self-non-self distinction doesn't really hold up. And this naive idea of there is molecular lock and key kind of binding that would help us identify pathogens via associated molecular patterns has also been somewhat abandoned, with the realization that many of these molecular patterns are in fact associated with a general kind of microbes, not just pathogens. Therefore, these PAMPs, these famous molecular patterns associated with pathogens, are not longer associated to be with pathogens, but rather more neutral with microbes. And some of them might be pathogenic in certain contexts and not. So it's not an intrinsic property of something to be a pathogen. And for sure, not all microbes should be considered pathogens. One conceptual update was put forward by Polly Matzinger and her idea that that would be something like danger or damage, where certain patterns would indicate that something has been going wrong in a cell, indicating danger. So tolerate microbes as long as they behave, and as soon as they start causing damage or being dangerous, then the immune system would need to step in. But then you would need to clarify what exactly would be a molecular pattern associated with damage and danger. there is some non-trivial problems with that. And it shifts already the idea of the immune system focusing so much on this specific molecular patterns and how we interpret them. Next slide, please. And here we can also see how deeply rooted all these anthropomorphic concepts, or talking of self, non-self, and dangers, are rooted in alluding to metaphors for their theoretical concepts, where there is not real clear-cut distinctions, as we saw, between the self and non-self. The boundaries also get a bit blurred when you want to take into account the microbiota as part of a healthy organism, for example. And also with what is considered dangerous or not, you get a certain ambiguity, and a lot of it depends on the context and not intrinsic notions that help explain the phenomenon in immunology. Overall, also, we can see that the immune system is not a single simple entity, but rather a rather complex system, which does a lot more than just defending an organism. So it's not just this a single defense entity. And therefore, the most recent and promising conceptual updates concern Thomas Pradeu's so-called discontinuity theory, abandoning the idea that there are some particular structures indicating danger or pathogens, but rather the dynamics of having something suddenly appear and distorting the physiology, that will be triggering an immune response. So that also makes it more quantifiable and helps answer a lot of questions. Then we're also putting forward the idea that it might not be just molecular structures, but really the effects on the organism. And you can see that also by studying other immune systems in plants, for example, where effector-triggered immunity is a well-known mechanism. So to put it in a nutshell, we don't have yet a new general theory of immunity, but there is some progress being made that allows for all this different knowledge of what the immune system does and what it consists of, that goes beyond this simplistic view of a defense of self against non-self. Plus, also accounting for all the other functions of the immune system it has besides defense, which you can see here in this kind of Venn diagram picture, where the immune system has a huge role in defending an organism, but it also takes part in other activities like clearing cellular debris and damaged products, repairing tissues, maintaining also a certain level of homeostasis within the tissue, and also interacting with developmental processes. The crosstalk also goes with a number of other physiological systems, including the nervous system, but also other kind of physiological regulatory systems, where the immune system does an integral part that goes beyond the simple idea of defending something against self or a non-self or danger. Back to you, Martin.
Yeah, and just let me ask, please.
No estaba muy seguro de que fueras tú, tío. ¿Qué tal? Bien, bien. Es que estos son un poco brutos.
Could you please turn? Yeah, thank you. All right, so now we want to focus on 3 features of the immune system. So first of all, the immune system is constantly interacting with itself and with its environment. And the contextuality concerns also, well, is broadly taking place on all sorts of levels. And so, for instance, which immune function is triggered, it depends on the integration of various signals. And for instance, one molecule or one cell can perform different functions. So there are interferons, which are molecules induced early on in, for instance, viral infection. And these basically lead to inflammation, which is crucial for defense, for the function of defense. However, interferons are also constitutively expressed in low levels in order to maintain homeostasis of tissues. When it comes to the defense, the function of defense, there is also some contextuality going on. So roughly there are 2 general strategies of defense. So one is resistance, which is illustrated on this diagram. So what you can do, what resistant means, is lowering the pathogen burden, but also what you can do is to limit the tissue damage, either due to the presence of the pathogen or the pathology caused by the reaction of the immune system. And so this other thing is called disease tolerance, and it's not either or, and it's also pathogen specific. Now, the puzzle of asymptomatic and symptomatic is kind of very well known these days. So one well-known case also is the typhoid Mary. So basically a case of a person who is infectious or carrying an infection but doesn't show any symptoms. And for instance, Medzitov and colleagues suggested that this might be a case of disease tolerance, so someone who is basically tolerating the presence of the microbe. And also there's debate on asymptomatic COVID-19 cases. So for instance, there is some studies like Liat colleagues show that there are the same viral loads when it comes to symptomatic as well as asymptomatic cases of COVID-19, and the difference in outcome, so whether someone is symptomatic or asymptomatic, can be explained at least in part or to some extent by the differences in tissue damage susceptibility. As Gregor mentioned, pathogenicity itself is not actually an intrinsic feature, but a complex and dynamic relation. So that means microbes often are pathogenic only under certain conditions. And for instance, viruses can even confer certain benefits or are even necessary for like developmental processes, but also they are protective, and Pradeu provides a philosophical perspective on some of these lessons drawn from virology. And so virulence or pathogenicity is actually a combination of features that are intrinsic both to the host and also to the virus. And this can be illustrated by so-called Batman disease transmission, where basically as an example of zoonosis, where bats harbor many viruses and they tolerate their presence, so they don't show any disease symptoms. But in humans, these can then actually cause quite severe disease. Now, when it comes to the immune system itself, basically it's not a monolith, it's a very complex system. This diagram just illustrates really just the main players, not at all exhaustive. And you can carve the immune system differently. So the known carvings are like immune and adaptive immune system, but also cellular and humoral immune system, or mucosal and systemic immune systems. And bear in mind that these carvings are to some extent artificial and overlapping. And as this picture also should illustrate the importance of regulation, which will come next, is quite important. So when it comes to the immune system, again, individuals are sometimes claimed to be immunocompetent or immunocompromised. So immunocompetent individuals are actually usually just defined negatively, which means that these are the individuals that do not show any sort of deficiency. However, immunocompetency is not simply a static or given feature of an individual, because, for instance, there are various polymorphisms which are not considered defects, but they have they influence the outcome of immune responses or how the immune response occurs. There are also developmental and aging differences or differences that occur in circadian rhythms. So the immune system works slightly differently throughout day and night, and this has also effect on susceptibility to various conditions, for instance. When it comes to the immunocompromised people, so we discuss immunodeficient people here. So the immunodeficiency is not necessarily associated with a system by defect. So although it is true that some immunodeficiencies are actually fatal, some other lead to broad susceptibility to diseases. There are immunodeficiencies that only confer a narrow susceptibility, and also some immunodeficiencies which show little to no clinical manifestations, like the very common IgA deficiency. And this points to important feature of many biological systems, such as the redundancy of some of that, and that's connected with robustness. So that's the feature of basically maintaining function despite some defects of some subpart of the system. Now, malnutrition is a case of secondary immunodeficiency, and it's basically considered detrimental, which is true in general, but there are also rare cases where some specific malnutrition can actually prove to be beneficial to the host. So, for instance, iron deficiency in malaria has been shown to be somewhat protective, and again, so this points to contextuality. Now, immunocompromised system is claimed to be a weaker immune system by like a CDC, but however, it's not the case, because some conditions, as we said, they don't manifest themselves, but more importantly, others actually suggest a problem of strong immune system, which is the condition, for instance, called IPEX, where there is a problem with regulation of the immune system. And so the importance of regulation comes up next. So any response involves a cascade of events, and that requires regulation on many levels. And it's actually immune dysregulation that is at the heart of the of pathology. So sometimes you don't really want to trigger an inflammatory response, but rather you want to trigger a tolerant response. And failure to do so results in like abortion, for instance, in pregnancy or in autoimmunity disorders. But other times, inducing immunological tolerance is actually part of the problem, like in cancer. Now there is also importance in cross-regulation of types of responses. So roughly speaking, type 1 responses are against intracellular pathogens, type 2 responses are against helminths, and type 3 responses against extracellular pathogens or microbes in general. And for instance, there has been an observed increase in type 2 immune responses found in severe cases of, in some severe cases of COVID-19. Another problem with COVID-19 is, for instance, and showcases the importance of regulation, is the antibodies against your own interferons discovered in some subset of COVID-19 patients that lead to delayed response and improper recruitment of other immune cells, therefore dysregulation. And the COVID, the SARS-CoV-2 might be also implicated in actually inducing some autoantibodies in a novel way. Now, when it comes to the elderly and COVID-19, again, this is not a problem of weaker immunity, as sometimes claimed, but rather of an improperly enhanced immune response or system, and therefore, again, a problem of dysregulation. Similarly, the cytokine storm basically is showcases the devastating effect of immune dysregulation, and dysregulation is, of course, not only a problem in defense, but in things like in maintaining homeostasis, in tissue repair, or even in disease tolerance. So we can modulate the immune system, which basically means something like to specifically intervene and trigger or facilitate certain responses. However, and I'm not gonna go through all these examples, but just to know that it's actually very tricky and complex. So you can somehow boost immune responses in a very specific way, or attenuate certain responses. But just to give you one example, so again, the case of interferons. So actually, they have been shown that the problem sometimes is the delayed interferon response in COVID-19, and so some studies are now on administering exogenous interferons to enhance antiviral responses, because interferons play a crucial role in that. But note that although they do enhance response, they also are implicated, or they are used in treating some autoimmunity disease like multiple sclerosis, because they actually reduce certain responses, like they reduce the expression of certain immune mediators, certain cytokines. And so there are many trade-offs. Some of them have been mentioned implicitly, but now let's consider some of them explicitly. So for instance, some aspects of the immune system are proved to be beneficial under some conditions, however, detrimental under other conditions. When it comes to the function of defense, the immunity, basically the immune response against a microbe, for instance, results always in immunopathology. Therefore, there needs to be some balance. Otherwise, the immune pathology itself can actually kill you. There is some incompatibility going on, pointing again to cross-regulation. So, for instance, if co-infection happens by two microbes, one triggering type 1 response, the other triggering like type 3 response, and there is cross-regulation, then you can actually lower the type 3 response, for instance, and that could prove detrimental. In disease tolerance, normal tissue function is basically lowered when it comes to the disease tolerance, because some mechanisms are inducible, and they basically inhibit normal tissue function. So again, there is this trade-off between tolerance and normal tissue function. And manipulating the immune system is also problematic because, for instance, some immunotherapies like checkpoint inhibitors in cancer, they lead to autoimmune diseases. at least in a subset of patients. And genetic makeup, of course. So the same thing can actually prove to confer some additional protection. However, it can also leave you, the same thing can leave, the same genetic makeup will leave you susceptible to another problem. Back to you, Gregor.
Thanks. Yeah, and to quickly wrap up, because our time is running out, just to emphasize again that this metaphorical frame in which immunology is usually being taught, communicated, and understood is somewhat inevitable in all these purposes and endeavors. And the metaphors there can both serve heuristic, theoretical, and rhetorical purposes, but they also come with detrimental effects, one of which is shifting away the focus from the immune system being much more than a defense entity. Next slide, please. And in particular, this usage of the term of a strong and weak immune system is particularly misleading. While within a very restricted context, it can have a descriptive value to have a certain binding interaction that is stronger or a certain specific response being stronger. But overall, it can be really deceiving when it comes with a kind of normative connotation where you want to make your immune system as strong as possible, as is then also sold in this advertisements indicated by Popeye in the corner here, when in fact, the cause of the pathology is actually a too strong immune response, and that you want to rather properly regulate and not abuse the immune system in an undesirable way. So there is a detriment to that. That also ties next into the kind of paradoxical thing that, in fact, it's more about fine-tuning the regulation, and having a strong immune response is not the thing you should think of in terms of therapeutic response. When immunodeficiency, and with all its difficulties that Martin so nicely explained, that comes with that, where the deficiency is not by too weak of immune system, but rather about this dysregulation and overreaction sometimes. And then in other contexts, it might not be applicable at all to speak about strong and weak, because it just has permanent changes that are not amenable to change anymore. It could also be that these terms of strong and weak do not apply at all. When think, for example, of homeostasis, how would it make sense to say that we have a stronger homeostasis than something else? And in overall, the most important takeaway message there is that it covers up, like it fails to cover and account for what the immune system does, and why, in what context it does fail. Next slide, please. In particular, for the case of COVID, one dangerous side effect there also is it provides a certain false sense of security, that if you have a strong immune system, you wouldn't need to be cautious or wouldn't need to get vaccinated, which is a very misleading idea, because as we've seen, weak immune system is not at the heart of the problem here. And we should really replace this metaphor talk with including more specific context, regulation, and trade-off considerations, rather than this narrow focus on defensive immunity. Next slide, please. So to just wrap up here and to conclude, that we should enrich our view of what the immune system is, what it does, and when it goes wrong. And the metaphors of strong, weak immunity have been misleading. Also the one about self, non-self, and defense in particularly, it both applies to the scientists and practitioners and the general audience that we need to explain the immune system somehow. And there we need metaphors for sure, but we should be aware of the detriments that come with that. For a better understanding of the immune system in terms of contextuality, regulation, and trade-offs, it will allow us to address questions that we still have about what COVID-19 does in an organism and in interaction with the immune system, and also for future pandemics and long-lasting effects about immunity in health. And in general, I think there is something to be gained from the interactions from philosophers and scientists to also intervene in science. And to end here, just to acknowledge the immunoconcept group, where both Martin and I had the pleasure of being, and which also gave us a great feedback on the paper, especially also to Shara Eberl, immunologist from the Pasteur Institute, who gave us useful feedback. And thanks to you all for your attention, and we're looking forward to your questions.